There is a coast you think you know. You have seen photographs of it. Sun on the water, boardwalks lit up at night, hotels burning their lamps so the tourists keep coming, tankers riding low in the water, heavy with fuel oil, moving steadily north and south along the American eastern seaboard, their navigation lights glowing like candles in a church. This was early 1942. The United States had just entered the greatest war in human history, and the eastern coast of North America looked, from certain perspectives, utterly at peace. From below the surface, it looked like a feast. This is the story of Operation Drumbeat, in German, Paukenschlag, a campaign that historian Michael Gannon, in his exhaustive study of the subject published in 1990, called nothing less than America's second Pearl Harbor. It is a story most Americans have never been taught. The sinkings were classified. The bodies that washed ashore were quietly removed. The newspapers were told to write about shipbuilding programs instead. And so, for decades, this chapter of the Second World War existed somewhere between official silence and uneasy footnote. It deserves more than a footnote. What you are about to hear is the account of roughly 8 months in which Axis submarines sank 609 ships, accounting for more than 3.1 million tons of desperately needed Allied supplies. Those are not abstract figures. They represent fuel that never reached refineries in Britain. They represent bauxite that never became aluminium for aircraft. They represent merchant mariners, ordinary men from Norway, the United States, Canada, Brazil, the Caribbean, who went to sea with no escort, no navy within reach, and no reliable warning system, and who simply did not come home. I have spent a long time sitting with this material. The historiographical debate around Operation Drumbeat is genuinely unsettled in places. Scholars still argue about the precise culpability of Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy, and whether his resistance to convoying was strategic stubbornness, institutional pride, or something closer to negligence. Michael Gannon, whose landmark 1990 book remains the foundational text on this campaign, placed the blame squarely on King. Other historians, including Clay Blair in his 2-volume work Hitler's U-Boat War, offered a more complicated picture of American unreadiness, one rooted in doctrine, resources, and institutional dysfunction, rather than the decisions of any single man. I am going to tell you both sides. I am going to tell you what the Germans planned, what they found when they got here, and how a nation that was, on paper, an industrial giant managed to be caught so completely unprepared. I am going to tell you about the men in those submarines, the commanders, their sealed orders, their tourist guides to New York Harbor, and the men on the tankers, the ones who made it into lifeboats and the ones who did not. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It is a story about systems, about pride, about the terrible arithmetic of war. When one side has learned its lessons and the other has not, it moves slowly at first, as all disasters do. One ship, then 3, then a dozen, and then it accelerates into something that the Allied world could barely comprehend. Pour yourself something warm, get comfortable. This is going to take a while. And before we go any further, if you find this kind of deep, slow, research-heavy history worth your time, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more where this came from. Chapter 1. The World on the 12th of December, the 11th of December, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Germany declared war on the United States. The announcement came from Adolf Hitler personally, before the Reichstag in Berlin. Not because he was strategically obliged to do so under the terms of the Tripartite Pact, which required German solidarity only in cases of American aggression, but because he apparently believed the United States was already a de facto belligerent anyway, and because he trusted, with misplaced confidence, that his Japanese allies would tie down American naval power in the Pacific for years to come. For Karl Dönitz, the Vizeadmiral commanding Germany's submarine force, This declaration was the moment he had been waiting for, and simultaneously a logistical problem he had been dreading. He had wanted to strike the American seaboard since the earliest months of the war. He understood, with the precision of a man who had spent his professional life studying the tonnage war, that sinking ships was not merely a military achievement. It was an economic calculation. Every tanker that went down represented fuel that never arrived. Every cargo freighter lost was material subtracted from the Allied war effort before it could be transformed into aircraft, artillery, or ammunition. Dönitz called this the tonnage war, and he believed it with the conviction of a man who had nearly won it the first time during the First World War, and who intended to win it definitively this time. The problem was range. Dönitz's most numerous submarine, the Type 7, was a remarkable machine. Roughly 217 tons of displacement when surfaced, crewed by approximately 44 men, capable of operating at depths that would have been considered suicidal by First World War standards. But the Type 7 had been designed primarily for the North Atlantic convoy routes, not for 3,000-mile crossing to the American coast. The crossing was possible, barely, but the boats would arrive with almost nothing in reserve. They could operate for perhaps 2 weeks before they needed to turn around. For a sustained campaign against American coastal shipping, they were not ideal instruments. The boats Dönitz actually needed were the Type Nikes, a larger, heavier, longer-range submarine, where the Type 7 carried roughly 14 torpedoes and had a range of approximately 8,000 nautical miles. The Type Nikes could carry 22 torpedoes and range considerably further. They were slower to dive and less nimble in combat, which made them more vulnerable in the congested, heavily defended waters of the North Atlantic convoy lanes. But the American coast, Dönitz was betting, would not be heavily defended. Not yet. The Americans had only been in the war for 4 days. On the 12th of December 1941, Dönitz sat down and began planning. He called the operation Paukenschlag, a German word that translates most directly as the beat of a kettle drum or a drum roll. He had a gift for naming things. Earlier in the war, German submariners had called the period of easy Allied losses in the North Atlantic the glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Now, if his calculations were correct, there was about to be a second happy time, and it would unfold not in the mid-Atlantic, but within sight of the American shoreline. His initial planning called for 12 Type IX boats to be assembled and dispatched simultaneously, striking the American coast in a coordinated first wave that would hit multiple locations at once, before the Americans could organize any response. What he got was considerably less than 12. Of his operational Type IX boats, in December 1941, many were already committed to existing patrol zones or undergoing refit. He scraped together 6. Then one of those 6 developed a mechanical fault and had to be withdrawn. That left 5 submarines, 5 individual boats, to carry out what would become one of the most devastating naval campaigns of the entire war. When historians write about American naval embarrassment in 1942, they are writing about the consequences of 5 submarines and the undefended shoreline that received them. The 5 boats were loaded to capacity. Every spare centimeter of interior space was used. Food, fuel, ammunition, torpedoes. Sailors slept between torpedo cases in the early days of the patrol. The freshwater tanks on some boats were drained and refilled with diesel oil, which meant that the crew would be using the desalination system for drinking water from the first day out. It was a patrol planned with the grim efficiency that the German submarine arm had developed over 2 years of Atlantic warfare. These were not reckless missions. They were calculated ones. The first boat to depart was U-123, under the command of Kapitän Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan, which left Lorient in German-occupied France on the 18th of December 1941. The others followed over the subsequent days, each carrying sealed orders to be opened only after crossing 20 degrees west longitude, roughly the meridian that runs through the Azores. Only then would each commander learn his specific patrol area. Dunitz had organized them to cover different sections of the American coast from Nova Scotia down to Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. No charts or official sailing directions were available for American coastal waters. Hardigan was given 2 tourist guidebooks to New York City, one of which contained a fold-out map of New York Harbor. That was the navigational intelligence for the opening attack on the American coastline. A tourist guide. The British knew they were coming. Roger Wynne, the barrister who ran the submarine tracking room in London, had been following U-boat signals traffic since the earliest days of the war. He was one of those rare wartime figures, not a naval officer by training, not a strategist by profession, but a man with an exceptional ability to infer operational patterns from fragmentary data. When the Type 9s made their routine radio signals upon leaving the Bay of Biscay, Wynne's team plotted them. Working from the slimmest of evidence, Wynne correctly deduced that these boats were heading for the American seaboard, correctly estimated their numbers, and cabled a detailed warning to Admiral King. He specified a heavy concentration of U-boats heading toward the North American coast. 21 boats in various stages of transit. King's staff received the warning. Very little else happened. There is a temptation, at this distance, to use the word incomprehensible for what followed. But incomprehensibility, in my view, is the lazy historian's way of avoiding the harder work of explanation. What followed was not incomprehensible. It was the consequence of pride, of doctrine, of institutional inertia, of an organization that had never been built for the kind of war that was now arriving at its door. To understand the disaster, you have to understand the institution. And that means understanding the United States Navy in December of 1941. That is what the next chapter is about. Chapter 2. The institution that was not ready the United States Navy that entered the Second World War was, by almost any conventional metric, an impressive force. It had battleships of extraordinary tonnage. It had fleet carriers that would eventually dominate the Pacific. It had yards that could build destroyers at a pace no other nation could match. It had a budget that dwarfed those of most European navies. And it had a tradition of professionalism that stretched back more than a century. On paper, in December of 1941, the United States Navy was one of the 2 or 3 most powerful sea services in the world. None of that mattered very much when it came to anti-submarine warfare on the eastern seaboard. And the reason is worth examining carefully. Anti-submarine warfare is not glamorous. It is slow, technically demanding, unglamorous escort work. The maritime equivalent of guarding a supply convoy on a dusty road. The United States Navy, like most navies of the period, was organized and philosophically oriented around the concept of fleet engagements. Large formations of surface ships, battleships and cruisers, meeting the enemy in decisive battle, the convoy escort, the patrol frigate, the unglamorous hunting of submarines in shallow coastal water. These were not the kinds of tasks that made careers or earned promotions. They were the tasks that the British Royal Navy had been conducting, with increasing skill and painful experience, since 1939. The British had learned. In the autumn of 1940, they had suffered the first happy time. That period when German U-boats had savaged North Atlantic convoys with relative impunity, before radar improved, before escort doctrine was refined, before very long-range aircraft could reach the mid-Atlantic air gap. They had paid for those lessons in ships and in lives. And as 1941 drew on, and American entry into the war became increasingly inevitable, the British did something remarkable. They tried to share everything they knew. They shared their convoy routing systems, their signal books, their control of shipping organization, their anti-submarine doctrine. They stationed Royal Navy officers at American ports. They offered to provide escorts. They gave warning after warning about the U-boat threat. The Americans, broadly speaking, did not listen. This is the conclusion not of hindsight, but of the contemporaneous record. Admiral Adolphus Andrews, who commanded the Eastern Sea frontier, the naval command responsible for the coastal waters from Maine south to North Carolina, was aware of the threat. He had practically no resources to meet it. In December of 1941, his command consisted of 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 patrol boats dating to 1919, 2 gunboats whose designs went back to 1905, and 4 wooden submarine chasers. Approximately 100 aircraft were nominally available, but these were short-range training models unsuitable for open-water anti-submarine patrol. The only large patrol aircraft, the consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers and the PBY Catalina seaplanes, that could actually hunt submarines effectively, were under Army Air Force's control, and the relationship between the United States Navy and the Army Air Forces in 1941 was, to put it diplomatically, historically antagonistic. Those aircraft were not coming to Andrews. The issue of destroyer availability is particularly painful to examine. On the 12th of January 1942, when Admiral Andrews received word that 3 or 4 U-boats were about to begin operations against his coastal shipping, he refused to institute a convoy system on the grounds that poorly escorted convoys would merely concentrate targets for the enemy. This was consistent with official United States Navy escort doctrine of the period, which held that convoy escorts should be powerful enough to destroy attackers, not merely to defend the merchantman. If you didn't have enough destroyers to actually hunt and sink submarines, the doctrine argued, you were better off not convoying at all. The convoy would simply draw the U-boat to the ships. The flaw in this reasoning, as the British had discovered at great cost by 1941, was that independent sailing was no safer than convoy, and was often considerably more dangerous. A convoy presented a submarine with a single tactical opportunity, complicated by the presence of escort vessels. An independently sailed merchant ship, proceeding along a predictable route at a predictable speed with its navigation lights burning, was a gift. The American doctrine had it precisely backwards, and the British had been saying so, politely but insistently, for months. The doctrine was not changed. On the 14th of January 1942, the Norwegian tanker Nornes was struck by torpedoes within sight of Long Island. No warships were dispatched to investigate. On the following night, U-123, Hardigan's boat, moved and sank the British tanker Coimbra off Sandy Hook. 13 destroyers were at anchor in New York Harbor that night. Not one of them was sent to respond. What makes this particularly difficult to account for is not the absence of ships. Andrews genuinely had few good ones, but the absence of improvisation. Other navies, when caught short, had pressed civilian vessels into service, fishing trawlers, whale catchers, pleasure yachts, with a depth charge rack bolted to the stern. The British had done exactly this in 1939 and 1940, and it had saved them from worse losses. The option was explicitly available to the United States Navy in the winter of 1942. It was not exercised. There is one figure at the center of this institutional failure who must be addressed directly. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy. King was by all accounts a formidable man and a capable strategist. He was also, by nearly all accounts, extremely difficult to work with, deeply resistant to external advice, and, in the view of historian Michael Gannon, personally responsible for the failure to institute an East Coast convoy system. In the critical weeks of early 1942, King had been warned by British intelligence, by his own staff, by the Canadians, and by the distress calls coming in from merchant ships. He was simultaneously managing a Pacific theater that had just suffered catastrophic losses at Pearl Harbor, and this is a mitigating factor. that should not be dismissed. But the Atlantic coast was his direct responsibility, and for critical weeks in early 1942, very little that was effective was done. By the time Hardigan's U-123 completed its first American patrol and turned back toward France in mid-February, it had sunk 7 ships totaling 46,744 tons. It returned to Lorient flying a pennant from its conning tower, with individual flags sewn to it marking each ship sunk. The boat came back to a hero's welcome. Every boat of the first wave came back safely. Not one of the 5 original Drumbeat submarines was lost. Not one. Chapter 3. The Men in the Boats. There is a temptation, when writing about submarine operations, to treat the submarines as the primary actors, to describe the technical specifications, the torpedo trajectories, the radio communications, as though the machines themselves were the story. They are not the story. The men inside them are. In December of 1941, the average German U-boat commander was a man in his mid to late 20s. He had been selected from the surface fleet, trained in an intensive program that combined mathematics, navigation, and a form of psychological conditioning designed to build confidence in isolated, high-pressure environments. The submarine service was understood within the German Navy as an elite arm, more demanding, more dangerous, and, in the 1939 to 1941 period, considerably more successful than any other branch of the German armed forces. The award rate for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross among U-boat commanders was strikingly high relative to other services. For a young officer of ambition and capability, submarines were the place to be. Reinhard Hardigan of U-123 was 32 years old when he left Lorient for the American coast. He was already a veteran commander with a previous patrol record, and he was not a man given to doubt or hesitation. His diary of the first Drumbeat patrol has survived, and it is one of the more revealing documents of the campaign. Not because it contains any extraordinary philosophical insight, but because of its tone. It reads like the account of a man who is confused, and then astonished, and then almost openly incredulous. He had expected to fight. He had expected American warships, American aircraft patrols, American coastal blackouts. What he found was a carnival. Hardigan wrote in his log, and this passage has been quoted in nearly every serious history of the campaign, that the American coast was lit up like a Christmas tree, that ships moved with their navigation lamps burning along predictable courses, and that there were times when he could count 10 vessels simultaneously visible from his conning tower. He was operating in coastal waters so shallow in places that the bottom was barely 40 meters below his keel, waters where a depth charge attack would have been extremely difficult to survive, but where no depth charges were coming anyway. He was not hiding from anything. He was simply selecting targets. The 5 commanders of the first Drumbeat wave, Hardigan in U-123, Ernst Kals in U-130, Robert Richard Zapp in U-66, Heinrich Bleichrott in U-109, and Ulrich Folkers in U-125, had been given considerable operational discretion once they arrived on station. Dönitz's instructions were to begin attacks simultaneously, if possible, on the 13th of January 1942. To achieve the maximum psychological impact of a coordinated assault. The actual start of hostilities was slightly staggered, but the effect was close enough. Within 24 hours of the first attacks, ships were burning off the American coast from Nova Scotia to the waters off New Jersey. Each boat carried a fixed allocation of torpedoes, and torpedoes were precious. They were technically complex weapons, and they were not being manufactured in unlimited quantities. Dönitz's standing guidance was to use torpedoes on large, high-value targets. Tankers above all. Tankers were the crown jewel of the tonnage war, because they carried oil. And oil was the material that powered everything the Allied war effort needed to function. An oil tanker sunk was not just a ship lost. It was weeks or months of fuel lost. Fuel for aircraft, fuel for warships, fuel for the trucks and lorries that moved armies across continents. Dunitz's men understood this, and they targeted tankers with a consistency that makes the loss lists from early 1942 genuinely painful to read through. The physical experience of a patrol of this length deserves some description, not for dramatic effect, but because it shaped the decisions these men made. A Type X U-boat on a transatlantic patrol carried roughly 50 crew members in a pressure hull roughly 76 meters long. That is a space roughly the length of a tennis court, shared by 50 men, their food, their tools, their weapons, and all the mechanical systems required to keep them alive. There was no shower. There was one toilet for 50 men, usable only when the boat was not diving or under attack. The temperature inside the hull alternated between freezing cold in the North Atlantic and tropical heat as the boats moved south along the American coast. The smell was, by every surviving account, extraordinary in the most negative possible sense. These conditions are not mentioned to provoke sympathy for the men who were doing the sinking. They are mentioned because they explain something important about the operational logic of the Drumbeat campaign. These men were not comfortable. They were not safe. They were a long way from home, in a metal tube, in the middle of a war, with a fixed amount of fuel and a fixed number of torpedoes and a very clear set of objectives. The fact that the American coast was so inadequately defended did not make them feel triumphant in any heroic sense. It made them efficient. They did their job with the brisk, professional competence of craftsmen who have been given the right tools for the task at hand. The American submariners, who would eventually be sent to hunt these boats, would for most of 1942 be chasing ghosts. The United States Navy's anti-submarine doctrine had been built around offensive patrol. The idea that destroyers should actively hunt submarines rather than sitting passively around a convoy. This sounded aggressive and purposeful. In practice, against a submarine that could lie on the seabed during daylight hours and surface at night, with no searchlights probing the water, offensive patrol accomplished very little. The U-boats knew the patrol schedules. They learned them within days. The patrols were regular, predictable, and staffed by crews who were new to anti-submarine work and equipped with sonar technology that was not yet reliable in shallow water. There is a specific detail from the first weeks of the Drumbeat campaign that has always struck me as the sharpest illustration of just how unequal this contest was. U-123, on its way south along the American coast, was at one point operating in water so shallow that it could barely submerge fully. The boat was in less than 40 meters of water at times. Any experienced submarine crew that had been there would have had an almost trivially easy target: a large metal object sitting on the bottom in shallow water, impossible to miss with even rudimentary sonar. But the anti-submarine crews were not there. The water was empty, except for the U-boat and the ships it was killing. Hardigan later noted in his log that he had at times been in more danger from running aground than from the American Navy. There is a footnote to the first Drumbeat wave that illuminates a different kind of human cost, and it belongs to the crew of the Canadian passenger freighter Cyclops. She was the first ship of the campaign to be sunk, struck by 2 torpedoes from U-123 on the 12th of January, 1942, approximately 230 kilometers southeast of Cape Sable, Nova Scotia, with 181 people aboard. 93 survived, 87 did not. They were the first of thousands. Chapter 4. The Shore That Would Not Go Dark. If there is a single image that captures the essential absurdity and the essential tragedy of the first months of Operation Drumbeat, it is this: a German submarine commander standing on his conning tower at 2 in the morning, looking toward the American coastline and seeing it lit up like a midsummer fairground. The hotels were open. The casino lights were burning. The navigation buoys were still flashing their helpful signals, and against all of that background illumination, the silhouettes of merchant ships, tankers, freighters, cargo vessels were as visible to a submarine's lookouts as insects pinned to a card. The failure to enforce a coastal blackout in the first months of 1942 is one of those facts that seems, at this distance, almost too basic to require explanation. And yet it demands one, because the explanation reveals a great deal about American civil society in early wartime. The war had arrived very suddenly. Pearl Harbor was the 7th of December, 1941. Germany's declaration of war was the 11th. By the 14th, the date of the first confirmed sinking off Long Island, barely a week had passed since the nation had officially entered the conflict. In a country that had been, up until days before, predominantly focused on domestic affairs, the institutions and habits of war had not yet been built. There were also specific economic and political pressures that resisted blackouts. Coastal resort towns, Atlantic City, Cape May, Virginia Beach, Miami, depended heavily on seasonal tourism. Their chambers of commerce and municipal governments were, in the winter of 1941 to 42, deeply reluctant to darken their boardwalks and close their hotels at the government's request. The official guidance issued to coastal communities as early as the 18th of December, 1941 had been that they should consider dimming their lights. Not that they must, not that the survival of merchant sailors depended on it, but that they should consider it as a polite suggestion. The commercial interests of Atlantic City were weighed against the survival of tanker crews. And, for several critical months, Atlantic City won. The British representatives who observed this from close range were, by all accounts, barely able to contain their frustration. They had been through the Blitz. They had watched their own coastal shipping be savaged during the first happy time of 1940. They understood viscerally and from experience what it meant to let shore lights illuminate your merchant ships for enemy submarines. They had enforced blackouts and removed navigational aids on their own coast within weeks of the war's outbreak. Now they were watching their American ally continue illuminating the path for the very submarines that were killing British, Norwegian, Canadian, and American sailors. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Reinhard Hardigan's log entry on this subject is worth dwelling on, not because it is uniquely eloquent, but because it is so specific. He described sailing U-123 southward along the New Jersey coast at night, with the shore lights visible and the ship traffic visible, and observing that the whole scene looked, in his words, like peacetime. He made a comparison to what he would have expected from a coastal approach in British waters. The absolute darkness, the removed buoys, the radio silence, and noted the difference with what appears, from the text, to be genuine disbelief. He was a professional. He had expected a professional adversary. What he found was a coastline that had not yet decided it was at war. The practical effect of the illuminated coast on submarine tactics was profound. U-boat doctrine for attacking surface ships involved placing the submarine between the target and the horizon to minimize the boat's own silhouette while maximizing the targets. In the North Atlantic convoy lanes, this was a calculated maneuver that required darkness and careful positioning. Off the American coast in January and February of 1942, the U-boats could essentially reverse this calculation. Submarines, operating seaward of the shipping lanes, were invisible against the dark ocean. The merchant ships sailing between the submarines and the lit shoreline were perfectly silhouetted. It was, from a tactical perspective, a near-ideal firing solution. The German commanders were not creating opportunities. The Americans were providing them. The question of radio discipline, or rather the lack of it, compounded the problem. British convoy doctrine, refined over 2 years of brutal experience, required strict radio silence from merchant ships, unless in acute distress. Position reports in plain text were absolutely prohibited. On the American coast, in early 1942, merchant ships were routinely broadcasting their positions in uncoded plain language. A U-boat commander equipped with a simple direction-finding receiver could, in principle, navigate to the position of a merchant ship by following its own radio transmissions. This was not a theoretical vulnerability. The British had warned specifically about it. It was not corrected for weeks. The dim-out of American coastal cities was finally ordered on the 18th of April, 1942, more than 3 months after the first Drumbeat attack. By that point, the mathematics of the campaign were already catastrophic. In January of that year, 37 ships had been sunk. In February, a further 71 ships were lost in the North Atlantic, most of them sailing independently in Western Atlantic waters. March brought no improvement. The blackout, when it finally came, was implemented by Rear Admiral Andrews and Lieutenant General Hugh Drum of the Army Eastern Defense Command, and its effect was measurable almost immediately. Ship losses along the eastern seaboard dropped significantly in the weeks following the dim-out. Hardigan's Carnival had its lights turned off, but those 3 months of illuminated coastline had already cost the Allies an incalculable amount. There is a social dimension to this failure that does not always make it into the military histories, and it deserves mention. The American public in early 1942 was being told very little about what was happening on their own coastline. The sinkings were not reported in the press with anything like the precision that subsequent historians would find in the classified naval records. Beachgoers along the Atlantic coast did sometimes find debris, oil slicks, pieces of timber, occasionally worse, but the official word was carefully managed. The United States Office of War Information was already working by the spring of 1942 to keep public attention on American shipbuilding capacity rather than on losses. New construction would outpace sinkings, the argument ran. The problem would sort itself out. For the sailors in the water, this institutional silence was the loneliest possible kind of abandonment. They were dying within sight of American shores, sometimes literally within sight of resort hotels with their lights still burning. And the public on those shores did not know their names, did not know their ships, and would not know, for decades, the scale of what was happening just off the beach. Chapter 5. The arithmetic of disaster numbers can lie. They can be arranged to obscure as much as they reveal. And in a campaign as large and complex as Operation Drumbeat, raw figures, tonnages, ship counts, loss percentages, can become a kind of numbing abstraction that actually prevents understanding rather than enabling it. So let me try to do something different here. Let me try to make the numbers mean something. In January of 1942, the 5 submarines of the first Drumbeat wave sank a combined total that represented only a fraction of what was coming. But the pattern those 5 boats established, the route, the timing, the targeting priority, was the template for everything that followed. Dönitz, reading the after-action reports from his returning commanders, wrote in his war diary that each commander had been presented with such an abundance of targets that he could not possibly use them all. There were times, Dönitz recorded, when there were as many as 10 ships in sight simultaneously, all sailing with lights on peacetime courses. This information was gold to a submarine commander engaged in a tonnage war. It meant that the American coast was not just a profitable target. It was the most profitable target on Earth in the winter of 1942, more profitable, ship for ship, than the North Atlantic convoy lanes, more profitable than the Mediterranean. The American eastern seaboard offered something almost no other operational zone offered: large, slow unescorted, illuminated targets with no meaningful counter-threat. Dönitz moved immediately to exploit this. He began sending the second wave of Type 9's boats, even before the first wave had returned. Then, recognizing that the shorter-range Type 7 submarines could be made to reach the American coast by cramming their interior spaces with extra fuel and crossing at minimum speed on a single engine, he began sending those as well. An extraordinary feat of logistical improvisation that reflected the desperation with which his command wanted to keep the pressure on the American coast. Some Type 7 crews filled their fresh water tanks with diesel oil and relied entirely on their desalination systems for the crossing. They arrived lean, cramped, and short of fresh water. But they arrived with their torpedoes intact and their orders clear. The Type 14 submarine, the U-tanker, a boat designed not to fight but to resupply, became the key enabling technology of the campaign's middle phase. U-459, the first operational Type 14, took up station roughly 600 miles northwest of Bermuda in late April of 1942. Between late April and the 6th of May, she transferred approximately 600 tons of fuel and a small quantity of torpedoes to 14 submarines, including Type 7 boats whose range to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean would otherwise have been impossible. The U-tanker extended the operational reach of the entire submarine force in a single deployment. The Americans had nothing equivalent and no doctrine for countering it. The progression of the campaign through the first half of 1942 follows a geographic logic that is almost elegant in its cruelty. The initial wave targeted the eastern seaboard, the corridor of shipping between Maine and Cape Hatteras that carried fuel oil from Gulf refineries northward to the cities and industries of the American Northeast. When American defenses on the eastern seaboard began slowly, haltingly to improve through the spring, the U-boats shifted south. They moved into the Caribbean, targeting the oil fields and refineries of Venezuela, Trinidad, and Aruba. When convoy protection extended into the Caribbean, they moved again into the Gulf of Mexico, where the defenses were even thinner and the targets even richer. In May of 1942, with the U-boat strength in American waters, peaking at 19 operational boats simultaneously, 115 ships were sunk in a single month. Nearly half of these were in the Gulf of Mexico. The month of June 1942 was the worst single month of the entire war for Allied shipping losses. 122 ships were sunk by U-boats across all theaters in that month alone. A figure that, when translated back into human terms, represents hundreds of merchant sailors dead, millions of gallons of oil lost, thousands of tons of war material on the seabed. Of the June losses, the vast majority were ships that had been sailing independently, without escort. Only 14 of June's sinkings occurred in convoys. The convoy system, the lesson the British and Canadians had been pressing the Americans to adopt since December of 1941, was proving, wherever it was actually implemented, to be exactly as effective as advertised. The problem was that it was still not universally implemented. The losses among tankers deserve particular emphasis, because tankers were not just ships. They were the circulatory system of the Allied war economy. The oil they carried moved from the refineries of Texas and Louisiana, northward to the industrial cities of the American Northeast, to the Royal Navy's fleet bases in Britain, to the air bases in Britain and North Africa that were beginning to mount the Allied strategic bombing campaign. Most of the 73 American tankers lost in the first half of 1942 were sunk in the American coastal zone or the Caribbean. 22 British tankers went down in March alone. 3 of the 4 largest Canadian tankers operating in the Western Hemisphere were lost between February and May. The impact on British oil stocks was severe enough that Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote directly to the United States Navy in March, urging them to organize coastal convoys. The letter produced a measured response. It did not produce convoys. Not yet. The American public response, filtered through a carefully managed press, missed most of this entirely. There is a striking passage in Michael Gannon's research where he describes tourists at Virginia Beach in June of 1942 watching in bewilderment as two American freighters were sunk in view of the shoreline while they stood on the beach. The ships burned. Lifeboats went into the water. People watched from the dunes. And then the next day, the hotels were still open, and the newspapers said little. The management of public information about the campaign was, from the American government's perspective, a practical necessity. Panic about coastal shipping would not help the war effort, but the consequence was that thousands of merchant mariners died in a campaign that their own country's citizens were not permitted to fully understand. The Canadians present an instructive contrast to the American response, and they do not always receive their due in the larger histories of this campaign. Within days of the first Drumbeat attacks, the Royal Canadian Navy had begun organizing coastal convoys on their own section of the Atlantic seaboard, despite having far fewer resources than the Americans. By March and April of 1942, the U-boats were explicitly avoiding Canadian convoy routes in favor of hunting in American waters, where the pickings were safer. The RCN was also managing the routing of all Allied merchant ships in the Western Hemisphere north of the equator, a responsibility they had held since the beginning of the war, and only transferred to the USN in July of 1942. This organizational detail matters. The Americans were, for the first months of the crisis, essentially receiving their routing guidance from the Canadians. Chapter 6. The slow turn of the tide change in institutional behavior is always slower than the urgency of crisis demands. This is not a criticism unique to the United States Navy. It is a nearly universal feature of large organizations under sudden stress. The mechanisms for changing doctrine, procuring equipment, training personnel, and restructuring command relationships all operate on timescales that are longer than the timescale on which a battle can be lost. The Battle of the Atlantic in the first half of 1942 was being lost faster than American institutions could respond. But they were responding, slowly, imperfectly, with friction and argument and bureaucratic delay. But they were responding. The first concrete change that had measurable effect was the Bucket Brigade convoy system, established by Admiral Andrews on the 1st of April, 1942. The concept was straightforward. Coastal convoys would move only during daylight hours, stopping each night in protected anchorages. It was not a full convoy system. It was a partial one, designed to operate within the very limited escort resources available. But it was a start, and it reflected a change in doctrine. The acknowledgement that shepherding merchant ships was more effective than hunting submarines in open water. The results were visible within weeks. Sinkings along the eastern seaboard dropped to 23 in April, after the Bucket Brigade began operating. By July, there were only 3 sinkings along the eastern seaboard for the entire month. By August, there were none. The technology was also catching up, however modestly. The key technological shift was not radar, which would become far more important later in the Battle of the Atlantic, but the availability of suitable aircraft for coastal anti-submarine patrol. Consolidated PBY Catalina seaplanes and B-24 Liberator bombers, fitted with anti-submarine equipment, began to be released for Eastern Sea frontier use through the spring of 1942. By May, Admiral Andrews had organized offshore convoys, escorted by more than 300 patrol aircraft, based at 19 separate airfields. The aircraft, combined with the growing number of escort ships, sourced in part from the ambitious 60 vessels in 60 days program that had been proclaimed as an emergency measure, began to change the balance of the coastal campaign. The official date of the first organized American coastal convoy is recorded as the 14th of May, 1942, when a convoy sailed from Hampton Roads, Virginia, to Key West, Florida, under proper naval escort. It was a modest beginning, a short coastal hop, not the transatlantic convoy system that would eventually define Allied anti-submarine strategy. But it was the acknowledgement of a principle that the British and Canadians had been urging for 5 months. The convoy was safer than the independent ship. The escort, however modest, was better than the empty sea. The U-boat captains noticed the change. They noticed it with the same professional attentiveness with which they had noticed the absence of defenses in January. Dönitz tracked the profitability of the American coastal zone using his formula of tonnage sunk per U-boat operational day at sea, a calculation that gave him a precise day-by-day measure of where his submarines were earning their keep and where they were wasting fuel. As the eastern seaboard convoy system tightened through May and into June, the ratio dropped. The coast was becoming expensive to operate in. Targets were harder to find. Escorts were appearing where there had been none before. The response was characteristically methodical. Dönitz did not argue with the arithmetic. He moved his boats south and west, following the gradient of undefended shipping toward the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. When the Gulf filled with defenses, he would move again, back toward the mid-Atlantic, toward the convoy lanes between Iceland and Greenland, and the air gap that Allied aircraft could not yet reach. But in June of 1942, all of that was still in the future. For now, the Gulf was open, the Caribbean was dangerous, and the Americans were still learning. There is one early Allied success in the coastal campaign that deserves specific attention, both because it was the first and because it illustrates how the tactical balance could shift when even minimal resources were properly applied. On the 14th of April, 1942, the destroyer USS Roper was conducting a night patrol off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. At approximately 0005 hours, her radar operator obtained a contact on the surface at roughly 700 meters. The contact was a U-boat running on the surface in the dark. Standard practice for a submarine in a zone where no effective countermeasures were expected. The Roper increased speed. The U-boat dove. The Roper held the sonar contact, maneuvered, and attacked with depth charges. U-85, Kapitän Leutnant Eberhard Greger commanding, was destroyed. All 40 crewmen were killed. She was the first U-boat sunk in United States coastal waters during the entire war. The significance of the Roper action was not just tactical, it was psychological, and it worked in both directions. For the American Navy, it was proof that the tools existed, that the training existed, and that the U-boats were not invulnerable when a properly equipped ship found them and pressed the attack with determination. For the U-boat force, it was a reminder that the American coast was not permanent paradise. Defenses would grow. The arithmetic would change. Dönitz himself acknowledged this in his war diary as the summer progressed. He wrote with characteristic precision about the declining productivity of American coastal operations and about the shift in the campaign's center of gravity back toward the North Atlantic convoy lanes. He did not write, at that point, anything that sounded like defeat. From his perspective, in the summer of 1942, the American campaign had been a triumph of the First Order. Hundreds of ships sunk, millions of tons of Allied supplies destroyed, the American Navy embarrassed before its own coastline, all at the cost of no U-boats lost in the first wave, and relatively few in the months that followed. He was right about all of that. What he was beginning to see, in the summer of 1942, was the leading edge of something larger. The industrial mobilization of the United States. New construction of escort vessels was accelerating. New anti-submarine aircraft were coming off the production lines. A sub-chaser training school had been established in Miami, Florida, turning out crews with specific anti-submarine doctrine at a pace that Germany's shipyards could not hope to match with new submarine production. The Americans were learning, slowly, painfully, with the characteristic inefficiency of a system under emergency transformation. But they were learning. And when a nation of that size and industrial capacity begins to learn something, the consequences tend to be significant. The turn was not yet complete in the summer of 1942. The Gulf of Mexico was still burning. The Caribbean was still dangerous. The air gap in the mid-Atlantic, that roughly 300-mile wide band of ocean that Allied land-based aircraft could not reach from either shore, remained a killing ground for convoys. The Battle of the Atlantic had chapters yet to be written that were darker, in some ways, than anything that had happened on the American coast. But the Roper's depth charges off Cape Hatteras in the darkness of April 1942 were a signal. The carnival lights were going out. The convoys were forming. The aircraft were coming. The United States was at last learning to fight the war it had entered. Chapter 7. The Caribbean Burns. There is a particular quality to Caribbean light in the early morning hours. A blue-black depth to the water. A phosphorescent shimmer along a vessel's wake. A clarity of air that makes stars visible almost to the horizon. Sailors who worked those waters in peacetime spoke of it with genuine affection. The tanker routes between the Venezuelan oil fields, the refineries of Aruba and Curaçao, and the fuel depots of the American Gulf ports ran through some of the most physically beautiful sea lanes on Earth. In the spring and summer of 1942, those same waters became a sustained catastrophe for Allied shipping that, in terms of tonnage lost per month, exceeded even the worst weeks of the Eastern Seaboard campaign. The shift of German submarine operations into the Caribbean did not happen all at once. It happened the way all strategic transitions happen in war. Gradually, then suddenly, as individual commanders responded to local conditions. And Dönitz's operational analysis updated his routing instructions in real time. The U-boats had been finding increasing resistance on the eastern seaboard through March and April. Convoys were forming, however imperfectly. Aircraft were beginning to appear. The ratio of tonnage sunk per operational day. The number that Dönitz tracked with the religious fervor of a man who believed that arithmetic alone could win the war was declining. He pointed his submarines south and west, toward waters where the calculation still worked in his favor. The first major attacks on Caribbean shipping concentrated around the island of Trinidad and the refineries at Point Fortin and Pointe-à-Pierre on its southwestern coast. Trinidad sat at the junction of two critical supply routes. The route carrying bauxite from British Guiana northward to American aluminium smelters, and the route carrying refined petroleum products northward from Venezuelan sources to the American and British war economies. Sinking ships in Trinidadian waters was not merely a tactical act. It was a direct intervention in the industrial supply chain of the entire Allied war effort. Dönitz understood this, and he concentrated resources accordingly. The Venezuelan coast and the Dutch refinery island of Aruba became the next focus of the campaign. Aruba was, in 1942, one of the most important single pieces of real estate in the Allied supply chain. The Lago Oil and Transport Company's refinery, there was the largest in the world, processing crude oil from Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela and turning it into aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, and heating oil for the Allied forces. When German submarines began operating within sight of Aruba's refinery stacks in February of 1942, a U-boat came close enough to the island to attempt a shore bombardment with its deck gun, though the attack did minimal structural damage. It was not a military operation in the conventional sense. It was a demonstration that the most critical industrial nodes of the Allied war economy were within reach of German weapons. The shore bombardment of Aruba on the 16th of February, 1942, is one of those episodes that historians of the campaign tend to handle briefly, because the physical damage was slight and no ships were lost in the harbour itself. But it deserves more attention than the damage figures suggest, because of what it represented psychologically and strategically. This was a German submarine firing its deck gun at the largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere, at a range close enough to make accuracy theoretically possible. The refinery was not destroyed. The submarine was not intercepted. No warships came. The boat that conducted the attack, U-156, under Kapitän Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein, withdrew without damage and went on to sink 4 tankers in the surrounding waters over the following days. The message the episode sent to Allied planners was unambiguous. Nowhere in the Western Atlantic was beyond reach. The human geography of the Caribbean campaign differed in one important respect from the Eastern Seaboard operations. The merchant sailors most at risk on the Caribbean routes were not primarily American. They were Norwegian. Norway had the largest merchant marine relative to its population of any country on Earth in 1942. And Norwegian tankers carried a disproportionate share of the Allied oil trade. They were British, Dutch, Trinidadian, Venezuelan, and from every corner of the Caribbean basin. Many of the sailors on the smaller coastal vessels were local men, Caribbean workers in the inter-island trade, who had no military training, no lifeboats equipped for deep-water survival, and no rescue services within any meaningful range. When their ships were sunk, survival often depended on reaching shore in a small boat before dehydration and exposure finished what the torpedo had begun. The distances involved in the Caribbean theater also created a rescue problem that was qualitatively different from the Eastern Seaboard. Off the coast of New Jersey or Virginia, a sinking ship's survivors were, if they were lucky, within range of Coast Guard stations and could be spotted from shore. In the Caribbean, a sinking might occur 150 kilometers from the nearest inhabited land, in waters where the currents ran unpredictably, and rescue vessels were days away. The standard naval practice of the period, which required a rescue vessel to be assigned to convoy escort specifically to recover survivors, was not being applied because there were no convoys. The survivors of sinkings in the Caribbean in the spring of 1942 often spent days, and sometimes more than a week, in open boats. The psychological effect of the Caribbean campaign on the regional population is one of the aspects of Operation Drumbeat that American-centered histories often miss. The residents of Trinidad, of Barbados, of Curaçao and Aruba watched the burning tankers from their shores. They saw the oil slicks washing up on their beaches. They saw the bodies. They saw lifeboats coming ashore carrying men who had survived days at sea. These were not distant statistics for people in the Caribbean. They were events visible from the shoreline, affecting their neighbors, their family members who worked in the oil industry, their entire economic framework. The terror that the German submarines created in Caribbean communities in 1942 has been significantly underwritten in the broader historiography of the Atlantic campaign. By June of 1942, when the overall loss figures for American waters reached their catastrophic peak, the Caribbean accounted for a substantial portion of the total. Dönitz was deploying boats on a rotating basis. As boats completed their Caribbean patrols and returned to French bases for fuel, ammunition, and rest, new boats were already on their way south, guided by the U-tankers positioned off Bermuda and the Azores. The resupply network was functioning with a precision that the Allied intelligence community was still struggling to map and counter. The Caribbean was not burning by accident. It was burning because a system had been built to keep it burning. And that system was, for the moment, working extremely well. The permanent resolution of the Caribbean crisis would eventually require the same tools that ended the Eastern Seaboard crisis: convoys, aircraft, and the painful coordination of American, British, and Canadian anti-submarine resources. But through the spring and into the summer of 1942, those tools were not yet in place in sufficient numbers. The Caribbean was the second act of the Drumbeat campaign, and in terms of sheer loss figures, It was arguably the most destructive act of all. What came next? The shift back to the North Atlantic convoy lanes, the Wolfpack campaigns of 1942 and early 1943, the escalating intelligence war, would be fought in colder, greyer waters, far from the blue warmth of the Caribbean. But the Caribbean campaign of 1942 is the part of this story that the survivors remembered longest because of what it felt like to be there. Oil covered, exposed, within sight of shore, and entirely alone. Chapter 8. The Gulf of Mexico. War comes inland. There is something genuinely disorienting about the idea of German submarines operating in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf is not the open ocean. It is, in geographical terms, almost a lake, a roughly 1,600,000 square kilometer body of water, enclosed by the American South, Texas, Mexico, Cuba, and the Florida Peninsula. Its deepest point is barely 3,700 meters. Its shipping routes converge, almost by physical necessity, into corridors that pass through the Straits of Florida and the Yucatan Channel. In the summer of 1942, those corridors were full of oil tankers, and the German Navy was about to take advantage of the fact. The decision to extend U-boat operations into the Gulf of Mexico was Dönitz's, made in late April of 1942, based on the arithmetic that was now becoming his most reliable navigational instrument. The eastern seaboard was hardening. The Caribbean was yielding less per operational day than it had in February. The Gulf, however, was essentially untouched. Its coastlines held some of the most critical oil infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. The refinery complexes of Port Arthur, Texas City, and Baton Rouge in Louisiana. The offshore platforms and pipeline systems feeding the American industrial heartland, and the constant procession of tankers carrying Gulf crude northward through Florida Straits and onward to the eastern cities. For an organization fighting a tonnage war, the Gulf was an obvious next step. The first U-boats to enter the Gulf did so through the Straits of Florida, the narrow channel between Florida and Cuba, and through the Yucatan Channel between Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. Entering either passage required care. The channels were shallow, the currents strong, and any submarine that suffered a mechanical problem in these confined waters would be in acute difficulty. The boats that made the transit successfully, however, found themselves in a world that looked, operationally, almost exactly like the eastern seaboard in January. Abundant targets, minimal defenses, and a predictable shipping pattern that made the work unnervingly straightforward. The human stakes of Gulf operations had a specific quality not found elsewhere in the Drumbeat campaign. The sailors on the ships sunk in the Gulf were, in many cases, within sight of the American mainland when they died. The oil slicks from sinkings washed up on Texas and Louisiana beaches. Wreckage drifted into the Mississippi River Delta. Survivors who made it into lifeboats could sometimes see shore lights. And yet, as had been the case on the eastern seaboard, rescue was not always swift. The defenses in the Gulf were thin, the rescue infrastructure was rudimentary, and the sheer volume of sinkings in May and June of 1942 overwhelmed whatever response capacity existed. In May of 1942, approximately 41 ships were sunk in the Gulf of Mexico and the approaches to the Caribbean, representing more than 200,000 tons of shipping. Some of these ships were tankers carrying aviation gasoline that was desperately needed in North Africa, where the British Eighth Army was fighting Rommel's forces in a campaign whose outcome would be shaped, in part, by fuel availability. It is one of the connecting threads of the 1942 strategic picture that the U-boat campaign in American waters was not merely an Atlantic naval matter. It was affecting land campaigns on the other side of the world. The Axis powers did not have submarines in the Gulf, because the Gulf was uniquely important to them as a geographical objective. They had submarines in the Gulf because the Gulf was the path of least resistance, the point in the Allied supply chain that was simultaneously the most critical and the least defended. This distinction matters because it reflects the essential nature of the tonnage war, as Dönitz conceived it. He was not trying to capture territory. He was not trying to achieve a decisive naval battle in the Mahanian tradition. He was trying to reduce the cumulative volume of Allied shipping to the point where the material flow supporting the British war effort could not be maintained. Every ship sunk anywhere in the Atlantic theatre contributed to that calculation, and the Gulf in the summer of 1942 was contributing enormously. The American response in the Gulf was shaped by the same organizational problems that had hampered the Eastern Seaboard response, but with an additional complication. The Gulf fell under a different naval command structure than the Eastern Seaboard. The Gulf Sea Frontier, headquartered in Miami under Rear Admiral James Kaufman, had its own resource constraints, its own command relationships with the Army Air Forces, and its own history of inter-service friction. Convoys in the Gulf, when they finally came, required coordination between the Navy, the Army Air Forces, the Coast Guard, and the civil maritime authorities of at least 3 countries. The coordination was slow to materialize. In the meantime, ships burned. There are 2 specific episodes from the Gulf campaign that deserve individual mention, not because they were the largest or the most lethal, but because of what they illustrate about the nature of the campaign at its human scale. The first is the sinking of the tanker Virginia on the 19th of May, 1942. She was struck by a torpedo from U-103, approximately 40 kilometers south-southeast of the Mississippi Delta. Her cargo was crude oil. She burned for 2 days. Her crew of 36 went into the water. 23 survived. The 13 who did not were simply unable to reach the few remaining lifeboats before the ship's forward sections went under. The Virginia sank in waters that would, in peacetime, have had Coast Guard patrol vessels within an hour's reach. On the 19th of May, 1942, the Gulf was still largely empty of protective vessels. The second episode that I want to draw attention to is not a single sinking, but a pattern. In the weeks that the Gulf campaign was at its height, the submarine commanders noted in their logs that they were sometimes hearing radio traffic from sinking ships. Distress calls, position reports, descriptions of the attacking vessel. These communications were accurate. They were being received by American naval authorities, and yet, in case after case, the response was delayed or absent. This was not malice. It was capacity. The Eastern Sea Frontier, the Gulf Sea Frontier, and the Caribbean Sea Frontier were all simultaneously overwhelmed with distress calls, all simultaneously lacking the escort ships and patrol aircraft that could respond meaningfully. The radio operators on those distant ships were not being ignored. They were being heard by a system that had run out of resources to answer. The end of the acute Gulf crisis came not because the defenses improved dramatically in a single moment, but because the geometry of protection slowly changed throughout the summer of 1942. Convoys were established. Aircraft were allocated. Direction-finding technology, which allowed shore stations to triangulate the position of a surfaced submarine from its radio transmissions, was deployed more effectively. The U-boats did not stop coming, but the cost of operating in the Gulf increased incrementally each week, and Dönitz's tonnage arithmetic began to reflect that. By September of 1942, the Gulf was no longer the most profitable zone in the Atlantic campaign. The boats were moving again, back toward the convoy lanes of the North Atlantic, toward the Wolfpack operations that would define the campaign's next, and in many ways most desperate phase. The Gulf campaign was over as a sustained offensive. Its consequences, in ships lost, in oil denied, in merchant sailors dead, would last far longer. Chapter 9. Wolfpacks. The doctrine of collective killing. The concept of the Wolfpack, in German, Rudeltaktik, literally pack tactics, is one of those military ideas that sounds almost poetic in retrospect, but was, in practice, a complex, frustrating, technically demanding method of naval warfare that required exceptional coordination across very long distances and never worked as cleanly as its theoretical design suggested. Dönitz had conceived it before the war, tested it in early Atlantic operations, and developed it through the 1941 convoy battles into the primary offensive doctrine of the submarine war. Understanding Wolfpacks requires understanding not just the tactics, but the communications architecture that made them possible, and the intelligence vulnerability that architecture created. The essential logic of Wolfpack operations was a response to a specific tactical problem. A single submarine patrolling a vast ocean had a very small probability of intercepting a convoy. The ocean is large, convoys move at various speeds on various routes, and the submarine's surface speed of roughly 17 knots and submerged speed of roughly 7 knots gave it a limited ability to reposition once it had information about an approaching convoy. A single submarine that found a convoy also faced the problem of escort vessels. If it attacked and revealed its position, the escorts would hunt it, and the convoy would alter course and accelerate away. The submarine was limited in what damage it could do alone. The Wolfpack solved this by disaggregating these problems. Individual submarines were deployed in extended patrol lines, sometimes spanning more than 300 kilometers, across the expected convoy routes in the mid-Atlantic. When one boat made contact with a convoy, it did not attack immediately. It shadowed the convoy, transmitted homing signals on a frequency monitored by other boats in the patrol line, and waited while Dönitz's headquarters in Lorient directed the other submarines toward the contact. When sufficient boats had gathered, typically between 8 and 15, though the numbers varied considerably, the attack was coordinated, usually at night, from multiple directions simultaneously. The escorts could not chase all the attackers at once. The convoy was hit from several angles before it could complete a defensive reorganization. The coordination of these operations required constant radio communication between the submarines and Lorient, and this was, ultimately, the Wolfpack system's critical vulnerability. Dönitz insisted on centralized operational control. He directed the patrol lines, adjusted them based on convoy routing intelligence provided by German naval intelligence, and managed the concentration of boats around targets himself from his headquarters. This required each submarine to transmit radio signals regularly, reporting position, fuel state, torpedoes remaining, and weather conditions. Those radio transmissions were being received not only by Lorient, but by Allied direction-finding stations that could triangulate the position of any surface submarine that transmitted for more than a few seconds. The Allies called this system HFDUF, high-frequency direction finding, and through 1942 and into 1943, it became one of the most important tactical tools in the convoy battle. The 1942 Wolfpack campaigns that followed the American coastal phase were concentrated primarily in the so-called Black Pit or Air Gap, the section of the North Atlantic roughly centered around 30 degrees west longitude, that lay beyond the range of Allied land-based aircraft operating from either Newfoundland or Iceland. This gap, which varied in width depending on the specific aircraft available, but was at times more than 300 miles wide, was the geographical heart of the tonnage war in the second half of 1942. Within the air gap, convoys had only their surface escorts for protection. U-boats could operate on the surface, using their diesel engines at full speed, with relative impunity from air attack. The kill ratios from Wolfpack attacks in the air gap through the autumn of 1942 were among the worst of the entire war. The convoy codes were also contributing to German success in this period, in a way that became one of the most sensitive intelligence controversies of the entire conflict. The German Naval Intelligence B-Dienst Service, Beobachtungsdienst, or Observation Service, had been reading Allied convoy cipher traffic on and off since 1940. Through most of 1942, B-Dienst was regularly crypting convoy routing signals, giving Dunitz's headquarters advance information about where convoys would be and when. This meant that the patrol lines were being positioned not through guesswork, but through actual foreknowledge of convoy movements. The Allies would not identify the depth of this compromise until late in the year, and the full cipher rekeying that would close the vulnerability was months away. In the autumn of 1942, Donitz's Wolfpacks were, in a very real operational sense, reading the Allies' mail. The escort commanders who fought the convoy battles of 1942 understood that something was wrong before the intelligence analysts confirmed it. Convoys that had been carefully rerouted were still being found. Patrol lines that seemed to be positioned ahead of convoy movements appeared to know the convoys were coming. The Admiralty's submarine tracking room, under Roger Wynne, was tracking the U-boat positions from Enigma decrypts, the top-secret British operation that had been reading German naval Enigma traffic. But a critical blackout of German submarine communications from the 1st of February to the end of November 1942 significantly degraded British visibility into U-boat movements for much of this period. The Germans had introduced a fourth rotor to the submarine Enigma machine, creating a new cipher variant that the crypt analysts at Bletchley Park could not immediately break. During those months, the Wolfpacks were hunting in a kind of operational darkness from which the Allies could not fully see them. The most experienced Allied convoy escort commanders, men like Captain Frederick John Walker of the Royal Navy, who was developing the anti-submarine hunting group tactics that would eventually prove decisive, were during this period working against this combination of compromised codes, limited aircraft, and technically demanding anti-submarine conditions with the tools they had. Walker's innovations, his aggressive use of forward-throwing weapons, his insistence on hunting submarines to exhaustion rather than breaking off to rejoin the convoy, his training programs for escort crews, were already in development through 1942. But the industrial and intelligence conditions that would allow those tactics to be decisive had not yet fully materialized. The doctrine was ahead of the hardware, and the hardware was ahead of the intelligence. Everything had to improve simultaneously, and through the bleak convoy battles of autumn 1942, it had not yet done so. The Wolfpack's psychological effect on merchant sailors and escort commanders alike deserves consideration. A convoy entering the air gap in the autumn of 1942 was entering a zone that every experienced merchant mariner understood to be genuinely dangerous. The drill of action stations, the sound of the ASDIC pinging through the hull, the explosions of depth charges somewhere in the dark. These were not abstract concerns. Crews on ships that had survived previous convoy battles knew what they were sailing into. The psychological burden on merchant sailors who made crossing after crossing through these waters, with no weapons, no ability to fight back, and a cargo of aviation fuel or ammunition beneath their feet, was immense. Many continued to sail because there was no alternative. The cargo had to cross, and someone had to sail it. The endurance required was not dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, unrecognized, and often fatal. The geography of the air gap was itself a kind of strategic problem that resisted easy solution. Very long-range aircraft, specifically the consolidated B-24 Liberator in its maritime patrol configuration, could close the gap, but there were never enough of them, and the competition for Liberator airframes in 1942 was ferocious. Strategic bombing commands on both sides of the Atlantic wanted every available heavy bomber for their own campaigns. The argument for allocating liberators to maritime patrol was made repeatedly and urgently by Admiral Sir Max Horton, who took command of Western Approaches Command in November of 1942, and by the Admiralty itself. The argument was sound, the allocation was slow. In the autumn of 1942, the gap remained open, and the Wolfpacks worked it methodically. Chapter 10. The Intelligence War, Enigma, Huff Duff, and the Invisible Battle, behind every visible act of the Battle of the Atlantic. Every torpedo that struck, every depth charge that fell, every convoy that was rerouted away from a waiting patrol line. There was an invisible battle being fought in rooms that did not officially exist, by people whose names would not be known for 30 years after the war ended. The intelligence war of the Atlantic Campaign is not a supplement to the military history. It is the military history at the level that determined outcomes. Understanding why the Battle of the Atlantic turned, when and how it did requires understanding, at least in outline, the architecture of this parallel conflict. The British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire is now one of the most famous intelligence enterprises in history. In 1942, it was one of the most tightly held secrets in the world. The operation had been working on German military cipher traffic since before the war, building on work done by Polish mathematicians who had made the initial break into the Enigma system and had passed their results to British and French intelligence just weeks before the German invasion of Poland in 1939. By 1940, Bletchley Park was reading German Air Force and Army Enigma traffic with sufficient regularity to provide operational intelligence to British commanders. The naval Enigma was harder. The sea introduces physical problems. Codebooks are lost when ships sink. Captured materials become waterlogged, and the Germans were acutely aware that their naval cipher was a critical vulnerability and treated it accordingly. The naval enigma was broken through a combination of mathematical brilliance and deliberate physical seizure, what intelligence historians call pinches. The Royal Navy conducted several operations specifically designed to capture enigma machines, codebooks, and associated materials from German naval vessels and weather ships before they could be scuttled. The most significant of these for the Atlantic Campaign occurred in May of 1941, when HMS Bulldog captured the German weathership München and recovered materials that allowed Bletchley to read the U-boat Enigma traffic under the designation Hydra for a critical period. The intelligence derived from this, routed through the submarine tracking room under Roger Wynne, and used to divert convoys away from U-boat patrol lines, had a measurable effect on Atlantic convoy losses through the second half of 1941. The German introduction of the four-rotor Enigma machine for U-boat traffic in February of 1942 created the blackout that would persist until the end of November that year, a period that coincided almost exactly with the worst months of the Atlantic Campaign. The new cipher variant, designated Triton by the Germans and Shark by the Bletchley analysts, defeated the British bomb computers because the fourth rotor multiplied the number of possible encryption settings by a factor that the existing hardware could not crack within operationally useful timeframes. The Bletchley analysts worked on Shark continuously through 1942, with escalating urgency as the convoy losses mounted. The break into Shark, when it came in December of 1942, was facilitated by a combination of mathematical advances, the capture of relevant materials from the German submarine U-559 in the Mediterranean in October, and sheer cumulative analytical effort. The men who died in that capture, in the cold water off the Egyptian coast, died saving Allied shipping in the Atlantic, though the connection between their sacrifice and its consequences would never be publicly acknowledged. The German B-Dienst operation reading Allied convoy ciphers represents the mirror image of this intelligence picture, and it is important to the Drumbeat story in a specific way. The Allied Naval Cipher Number 3, which was used by American, British, and Canadian naval commands to coordinate convoy routing in the Western Atlantic, had been compromised by German intelligence as early as the autumn of 1941. For much of 1942, B-Dienst was reading this traffic with a delay measured in hours, sometimes less. The consequences for convoy routing were direct. Dönitz's headquarters knew convoy departure times, courses, and expected positions because they were reading the routing orders as they were transmitted. The Allied cipher was replaced in June of 1943, but the damage it did in 1942 is incalculable. The Huff-Duff system, the Allied high-frequency direction-finding network that could locate a transmitting submarine by triangulating its radio signals from multiple shore stations, was simultaneously being developed and deployed through the middle years of the campaign. By 1942, Huff-Duff stations had been established on both sides of the North Atlantic, and a small number of escort vessels had been fitted with shipborne Huff-Duff equipment, allowing them to obtain direction-finding fixes on transmitting U-boats without relying on shore stations at all. A U-boat that transmitted for as little as 20 or 30 seconds could be located to within a few degrees of bearing by a properly equipped escort. This meant that the very communications architecture on which Wolfpack tactics depended, the requirement for submarines to transmit regularly to Lorients, was simultaneously the architecture that made them findable. The tension between these two intelligence realities, Dönitz reading convoy routes, the Allies locating transmitting submarines, created a dynamic that historians have called a kind of invisible chess game, played simultaneously on both sides, with incomplete knowledge of the other's capabilities. Neither side fully understood what the other was reading or locating. Dönitz suspected at various points that the Allied routing of convoys was intelligence-driven, rather than merely cautious navigation. But his security investigations consistently concluded that the Enigma cipher was secure. He was wrong. The Allies suspected at various points that the German foreknowledge of convoy routes went beyond mere calculation. But the full extent of the B-Dienst compromise was not confirmed until after the war. The battle was being fought in a fog of partial intelligence on both sides, and the specific shape of the fighting reflected that fog in ways that are sometimes only visible in retrospect. There is a specific intelligence episode from the Drumbeat campaign that is rarely discussed in popular accounts, but deserves careful attention. In January of 1942, when the first Drumbeat wave was already approaching the American coast, there is evidence that the American code-breaking operation at the Navy's Communications Intelligence Office in Washington was receiving processed intelligence, suggesting the transit of large Type IX submarines toward Western Atlantic waters. The precise state of American communications intelligence at this point is still incompletely declassified. But what is clear from the available record is that the intelligence warning to Admiral King's staff from Roger Wynne in London arrived at approximately the same time as American analytical work was suggesting the same threat. The information was available. The institutional response was not. The technological trajectory of the intelligence war through 1942 and into 1943 is a story of incremental Allied advantage, slowly accumulating against a German system that was increasingly exposed. The four-rotor Enigma blackout was the Germans' high watermark of communication security, and it happened to coincide with the worst period of convoy losses. When it was broken, the effect was not immediate. Intelligence has to be acted upon, and acting on it requires ships and aircraft and coordination. But it was decisive over time. The wolf packs that had hunted blind in the gap suddenly found that their patrol lines were being avoided, their rendezvous with U tankers were being discovered, and their transit routes were known. The accumulated effect of this shift in intelligence advantage would not be fully apparent until the spring of 1943. But the roots of the German defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic lie partly in this room at Bletchley Park in December of 1942. The human cost of maintaining the secrecy of the Bletchley operation was, in a certain sense, one of the more terrible necessities of the entire war. Intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts, codenamed Ultra, could only be acted upon in ways that did not reveal its source. Convoys could not always be rerouted, because routing every convoy away from every U-boat patrol line would eventually tell the Germans that their cipher had been broken. Attacks could not always be mounted on submarine positions derived from decrypts, because a consistent pattern of precise attacks on recently transmitted positions would make the source obvious. There were, therefore, occasions when Allied commanders and intelligence officers knew that ships were sailing into danger and could not prevent it without compromising the source. How many ships and how many sailors died in those calculations is a question the records can suggest but never fully answer. Chapter 11. Technology turns. The tide wars are decided by morale, by leadership, by strategy, by geography, and by the random contingencies that no plan survives intact. But in the Battle of the Atlantic, more than in almost any other sustained military campaign of the Second World War, the outcome was shaped by technology, by specific machines, systems, and physical innovations that changed the tactical balance incrementally, and then, in a compressed period of months in 1943, decisively. Understanding the technological turn of the tide is essential to understanding why the war ended when and how it did. The radar story is the most important part of the technological narrative, and it is more complicated than popular accounts usually acknowledge. Radar, the use of radio waves to detect objects at range, had been under development by multiple nations through the 1930s, and by 1942, both the Allies and Germany had operational radar systems. The crucial distinction that determined the Atlantic battle was not the existence of radar, but the specific frequency at which it operated. Early Allied radar, operating on metric wavelengths, produced a strong enough return on a surfaced submarine to be tactically useful. But German submarines were quickly equipped with receivers that could detect the radar's emissions before the radar could see the submarine. The receiver warned the U-boat that it was being scanned, giving the crew time to dive before the attacking aircraft or ship could reach them. The development of the centimetric radar, which operated at a wavelength short enough that existing German receiver technology could not detect it, was therefore one of the most consequential engineering achievements of the entire war. The physical key to centimetric radar was the cavity magnetron, a device developed at the University of Birmingham by John Randall and Harry Boot in February of 1940. The magnetron generated microwave energy at a power level that made centimetric radar operationally viable for the first time. When this technology was transferred to the United States in the autumn of 1940 through the TISAD mission, a British technical delegation that carried the magnetron and other radar secrets across the Atlantic as part of the technology sharing agreement between the two countries. It became the basis for the American radar development program that would eventually produce the systems fitted to Atlantic convoy escorts. The centimetric radar sets, principally the American 10-centimeter ASV Mark III fitted to maritime patrol aircraft, began to reach operational squadrons through the end of 1942 and into early 1943. Their effect was immediate and dramatic. A U-boat surfaced at night, which was standard practice, was now detectable by patrol aircraft at ranges of approximately 8 kilometers, without any warning to the submarine crew. Aircraft fitted with the new radar and with Lee lights. Powerful searchlights that could illuminate a surfaced submarine at the moment of attack could approach a U-boat in darkness, switch on the searchlight at close range, and attack before the crew had time to react. The first operational use of the ASV Mark III with Lee light in an attack on a U-boat occurred in June of 1942. It was, for the German submarine crews, the appearance of something they had no immediate countermeasure against. The development of effective airborne anti-submarine weapons ran in parallel with the sensor improvements. And this is where the engineering narrative becomes truly specific. Depth charges, the standard weapon for attacking submerged submarines, were designed to sink to a predetermined depth before exploding. Early depth charge settings were often too deep, partly because theoreticians had overestimated a diving submarine's ability to get deep quickly, and partly because the aircraft attacking a surface submarine was dealing with a target that had just dived and was still in the upper portion of its dive when the depth charges arrived. The modification of standard settings to shallower detonation depths, a change advocated and implemented by the Operational Research Section of Coastal Command, the analytical unit led by physicist Patrick Blackett, had a measurable effect on the lethal rate of aircraft depth charge attacks. This is one of the less romantic details of the technological campaign, but it is characteristic of the kind of incremental improvement that collectively changed the battle's outcome. Forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons represent a separate strand of the technology story that deserves its own paragraph. The standard ship-mounted anti-submarine weapon of the early war period was the stern-mounted depth charge pattern, a pattern of depth charges rolled off the back of an escort ship as it passed over a sonar contact. The problem with this was an inherent loss of contact. The escort's sonar lost the submarine in the last few hundred meters of its approach run, during which time the submarine could maneuver. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing weapon that fired a pattern of small contact-detonated charges ahead of the escort ship while it still held sonar contact, was introduced in 1942 and progressively fitted to British and American escorts. It was initially unpopular with crews because it left no visible explosion when it missed, which they found psychologically unsatisfying. When it hit, it killed. The Hedgehog's kill-to-attack ratio was eventually demonstrated to be considerably better than that of conventional depth charge patterns. The air power dimension of the technological campaign requires one more specific observation: the very long-range aircraft. The B-24 Liberator in its maritime patrol configuration, stripped of much of its bomb bay equipment and fitted with additional fuel tanks, radar, and anti-submarine weapons, had a range that could, in principle, close the air gap entirely. The argument for converting sufficient numbers of Liberators to this role was made with increasing urgency through 1942. It was resisted by strategic bombing commands who wanted every heavy bomber for attacks on German industry, and by American planners who had their own Pacific requirements. The argument was not resolved in a single meeting. It was resolved slowly, through the accumulating evidence of convoy loss statistics that made the cost of the air gap unmistakable to anyone who read them. The German technological response to Allied radar improvements was itself a story of engineering effort and strategic adaptation. The Metox radar warning receiver, which detected earlier Allied radar emissions, was fitted to U-boats through the latter half of 1942 and was believed by the submarine crews to have solved the radar detection problem. It did not detect the new centimetric radar at all. Worse, the Metox itself emitted low-level radio frequency radiation from its own antenna, and there was a period of genuine and serious suspicion within the German submarine command that METOX emissions were being used to locate U-boats. This turned out to be wrong. The Allies were not, in fact, homing on METOX emissions. But the episode illustrates the mutual technical paranoia of both sides in the intelligence and technology war, and the difficulty of making accurate technical assessments under the pressures of an active campaign. The cumulative effect of the Allied technological improvements was not visible in any single month's statistics. It appeared in a trend that, if you graphed the ratio of U-boats sunk to convoys attacked across the months of 1942, showed an unmistakable, slow improvement in Allied effectiveness through the last quarter of the year. The Wolfpacks were still finding convoys. The air gap was still largely undefended. The cipher situation was still not fully resolved, but the single submarine attack in clear weather against an unescorted merchant ship, the core method of Operation Drumbeat at its height, was becoming increasingly dangerous for the attacker. The tactical environment was changing one technology at a time, and the direction of change was always the same. The American technological contribution to this process was not only in hardware. The operational research methodology that Patrick Blackett had pioneered in Britain, the rigorous statistical analysis of combat data to identify which tactics, weapon settings, and procedures were actually effective, was adopted by the American Anti-Submarine Command through 1942 and refined into one of the most productive applications of scientific method to military problems in the entire war. Anti-submarine warfare, it turned out, was amenable to quantitative analysis in ways that other forms of combat were not. The questions it posed: how deep should a depth charge be set? At what range should an aircraft attack? How many escorts is enough for a convoy of a given size? Were questions that data could answer if someone was collecting and analyzing the data. By the end of 1942, someone was. Chapter 12, The Turning Point. Black May and the Cost of the Campaign. The spring of 1943 is where the Battle of the Atlantic turned. Historians generally agree on this, which is unusual, because historians generally agree on very little. The specific month, May of 1943, is even more precisely identified in the literature, and it has acquired a name from the German perspective, Schwarze Mai, or Black May. In that single month, 41 German submarines were lost across all theatres, while Allied convoy losses fell sharply from the catastrophic levels of the preceding months. Dönitz withdrew the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic convoy routes on the 24th of May, 1943, effectively acknowledging that the tactical conditions that had made convoy attacks viable were no longer present. It was not a final defeat. The U-boats would return with new technologies and new tactics. But it was the moment when the fundamental arithmetic of the tonnage war shifted permanently against Germany. To understand Black May, you have to understand what the winter and early spring of 1943 had looked like. February of that year had produced convoy battles of almost unimaginable intensity. Escort groups defending against coordinated Wolfpack attacks of 15 and 20 boats in the air gap, with losses running at rates that briefly appeared to threaten the viability of the entire convoy system. In one set of convoy battles in March, the attacks on convoys HX-229 and SC-122, 21 ships were sunk from 2 consecutive convoys in roughly the same section of ocean over a period of 4 days. It was the largest single defeat suffered by Allied convoy forces in the entire war. The Admiralty's internal assessment in mid-March of 1943 contained, for the first time, explicit language about whether the convoy system could be sustained against the current level of attack. What changed between March and May was not a single thing, but several things simultaneously. The centimetric radar became available in operationally significant numbers on aircraft assigned to the air gap approaches. The first escort carrier, a small carrier from a merchant hull, capable of providing air cover within the convoy's immediate vicinity, was deployed on the North Atlantic convoy run in March and began flying patrols over the convoys it accompanied. The first of the dedicated anti-submarine support groups, free-ranging hunter-killer groups that could be directed toward a submarine contact without breaking up the escort screen of an existing convoy, began operations under Captain Frederick Walker and others who had spent years developing the doctrine for exactly this kind of aggressive, sustained submarine hunting. Very long-range Liberator aircraft, finally allocated in sufficient numbers, began closing the air gap from both ends. The effect of air cover on Wolfpack operations was not subtle. A submarine that could be attacked from the air could not shadow a convoy on the surface in daylight. Shadowing on the surface was the essential first step of Wolfpack assembly. Without the shadowing boat, transmitting homing signals from the surface, the other boats could not concentrate. Air cover broke the shadowing cycle at its origin. A convoy that had air cover overhead, even intermittent air cover from a single aircraft, was a convoy that Wolfpacks had extreme difficulty in assembling against. The mathematical consequence of this was visible in the attack statistics of the spring convoys almost immediately. The intelligence picture had also shifted decisively. The breaking of the four-rotor Enigma in December of 1942 had restored Bletchley Park's ability to read U-boat traffic, and the improvement in the quality of submarine tracking room intelligence through the early months of 1943 was reflected in convoy routing that, for the first time since the summer of 1941, was consistently able to steer convoys around patrol lines rather than into them. Simultaneously, the Allied cipher replacement, the introduction of a new system that B-Dienst could not read, removed German foreknowledge of convoy routes. The information asymmetry that had existed through most of 1942, in which the Germans knew where the convoys were going, and the Allies could not reliably locate the U-boats, was reversed almost completely within the space of a few months. Dönitz recognized what was happening with a clarity that the historical record makes almost poignant. His war diary entries for May of 1943 do not reflect denial or confusion. They reflect the analytical intelligence of a man reading numbers and understanding what they mean. The loss rate for submarines was simply too high. The tonnage being sunk per U-boat operational day had fallen to levels that could not be justified against the losses. He wrote, in substance, that the U-boats had lost the battle of technical equipment. He was correct. The acoustic homing torpedo, new submarine designs, schnorkel breathing masts that would allow submarines to charge batteries without surfacing, all of these were in development or production, but they were not yet available in the numbers needed. The withdrawal of the 24th of May was a tactical decision made with strategic intelligence. It was not the end of the U-boat war, but it was the moment when the outcome of the Atlantic campaign became, for the first time, genuinely predictable. The specific cost of the campaign from its drumbeat origins through Black May must be faced honestly, because the numbers have a way of being cited in aggregate and then slipping past comprehension. From the opening of Operation Drumbeat in January of 1942 through the end of the acute campaign crisis, in the autumn of that year, roughly 600 Allied merchant ships were sunk in the Western Atlantic Theater, including the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. More than 5,000 Allied merchant sailors were killed in American coastal waters and the Western Atlantic in that period alone. Men from at least 24 nations who had no weapons to fight back with and who were, in the majority of cases, given no effective protection by the naval authorities responsible for their safety. The German losses through the same period tell a different story of the campaign's balance. In the opening months of Drumbeat, January through April of 1942, German submarine losses were extraordinarily low. Of the 5 original Drumbeat boats, not one was lost. In January and February, the total number of U-boats sunk in all theatres was in single figures. The campaign was, from the German Submarine Command's perspective, profitable beyond any reasonable expectation. The losses came later, as the convoy system tightened, as the technology improved, as the intelligence shifted, and they accelerated through 1943 into casualty rates that represented genuine catastrophic attrition for the submarine service. There is a historiographical debate about Operation Drumbeat that I want to address directly because it is one of the genuinely unsettled questions in the literature, and it has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The debate concerns Admiral Ernest King and the degree to which his personal decisions delayed the establishment of the coastal convoy system. Michael Gannon, in his 1990 study, argued that King's resistance to convoying in the winter of 1942 was a primary cause of the catastrophic losses of that period, and that King bore personal responsibility for the deaths of thousands of sailors who might have been protected. Clay Blair, writing in his exhaustive 2-volume study published in the mid-90s, argued that the resource constraints were so severe and the institutional problems so deep that placing primary blame on King was an oversimplification. The British historian W.J.R. Gardner and several subsequent scholars have taken positions between these poles. The debate matters not because it changes the casualty figures, but because it determines how we understand institutional accountability in wartime. Whether failures of this magnitude require identifiable individual culpability, or whether they are the product of systemic conditions that no individual could fully control. My own reading of the available record inclines toward a middle position, that King's personal decisions did delay the convoy system, that this delay had measurable and terrible consequences, and that the systemic factors were real and significant, but do not fully excuse individual choices made in the face of clear warning and available precedent. The British had solved this problem at great cost by 1941. The solution was available. It was not adopted as quickly as the evidence warranted. Why it was not adopted as quickly as the evidence warranted is a question that the historical record answers, imperfectly but unmistakably, with the words institutional pride and doctrinal stubbornness. The final accounting of Operation Drumbeat in its broadest sense is this. It was the most successful single offensive operation in the entire German submarine campaign. It killed more Allied shipping in less time, at less cost, than any comparable period of the war. It exploited American unpreparedness with a precision and efficiency that reflected careful planning and professional execution. And it was eventually stopped not by a decisive battle or a sudden strategic reversal, but by the slow, painful, often bureaucratically obstructed application of tools and methods that were available from the beginning. Convoys, air cover, radar, and the basic organizational discipline to protect ships at sea. The gap between when those tools were available and when they were applied is a gap that was paid for in human lives. That gap is what this story is ultimately about. Chapter 13. The Men Who Did Not Come Home. The Merchant Marine and Its Forgotten War. There is a particular kind of invisibility that attaches itself to certain categories of wartime service, and nowhere is that invisibility more historically persistent than around the Merchant Marine. The men who sailed the Atlantic convoys and the American coastal routes in 1942 were not soldiers. They did not wear uniforms in the conventional military sense. They were not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They were employed, technically, as civilian workers by the shipping companies that owned their vessels, which meant that when they were killed at sea, their deaths were not recorded in military casualty figures. Their families did not receive military death benefits, and their sacrifice was not commemorated in the same framework that honored the men in uniform who died on land or in the air. This bureaucratic distinction, which cost nothing to maintain and enormous human dignity to impose, was one of the more quietly shameful administrative decisions of the Second World War. The merchant sailors who crossed the Atlantic, who carried the oil and the bauxite and the aviation gasoline and the food and the weapons that kept the Allied war effort alive, came from everywhere. American merchant mariners sailed alongside Norwegians, whose merchant marine had been pressed entirely into Allied service after the German occupation of their country in 1940. British sailors from the Port of London, from Liverpool, from Bristol and Cardiff, sailed the same waters as men from Trinidad, from the Bahamas, from India, from Panama, from the Dutch Caribbean islands. The ships were flagged variously. Panamanian registry, Honduran registry, British registry, American, and the flags determined, in the event of a sinking, which bureaucratic framework decided how the survivors would be treated and whether the dead would be officially mourned. Many of the flags provided very little comfort of either kind. The specific experience of being torpedoed at sea in 1942 has been recorded in enough survivor accounts that certain patterns emerge with consistency. The first sensation survivors consistently report was not an explosion but a concussion, a physical shock transmitted through the hull and through the water, experienced as a bodily blow rather than a sound. The sound came after. Then the lights went out. Then, in the case of a tanker carrying petroleum products, the fire. The fire is the detail that appears in nearly every tanker survivor account, and it distinguishes the tanker crew's experience from that of men on dry cargo ships. The oil ignited, spread across the water, and burned in a ring around the ship. The men in the water had to swim through it or around it, and some could not. Lifeboats that were launched into burning oil did not survive. Men who jumped from the stern and swam clear lived, if they were strong enough to reach the undamaged water beyond the oil slick. The lifeboats themselves, the standard survival technology of 1942, were designed for calmer conditions and shorter survival times than the actual circumstances of Atlantic sinkings routinely imposed. A standard merchant vessel lifeboat of the period was an open wooden boat equipped with a small sail, hand-cranked oars, a compass, a small water supply, some emergency rations, and basic first aid materials. In the open Atlantic in January or February, in the seas off Cape Hatteras, or in the Windward Passage, the temperature of the water was cold enough that a man without proper survival clothing who went into it could expect to lose consciousness within minutes. The lifeboats provided marginal thermal protection. Men in them, in cold water conditions, died of exposure within hours or days. The survival time for lifeboat occupants in the Caribbean in summer was considerably better. Sometimes survivors remained alive for a week or more, but the psychological ordeal of watching the horizon for a rescue ship that might not come was its own form of prolonged suffering. The rescue doctrine of the 1942 convoy period adds a layer of complexity that reflects one of the genuine moral dilemmas of convoy operations. An escort commander whose convoy was under attack faced a specific and terrible calculation. If he detached one of his escorts to rescue survivors from a sinking ship, he reduced the defensive screen available to the remaining merchant ships at the most dangerous moment, during an active attack. The Admiralty's formal guidance was that escorts should not stop to rescue survivors during an attack, because stopping made the rescue vessel itself a vulnerable target and potentially weakened the defense enough to cause further losses. This guidance was operationally sound. It condemned men in the water to watch their rescuers sail past them and disappear over the horizon. A dedicated rescue ship, a slower vessel added to convoys specifically for the purpose of recovering survivors, was eventually added to convoy compositions in 1943. But for most of the drumbeat period, these did not exist in the Western Atlantic. The American merchant mariners who survived the coastal attacks of early 1942 sometimes came ashore in remarkably direct ways. There are documented cases from the Virginia and North Carolina coast where survivors rowed or sailed their lifeboats to beach landings, where local residents found them in the sand. Some of these men had been in the water for hours. Some were burned. All of them were witnesses to a campaign that the American public was being officially told very little about. The management of these survivors by naval authorities, the debriefings, the requests for discretion, the implicit pressure not to speak publicly about the location or nature of the attacks was not sinister in the conspiratorial sense, but it was systematic, and its effect was to keep the American public from understanding what was happening in their own coastal waters for months longer than was strictly necessary. The Norwegian Merchant Marine's contribution to the Allied war effort during the entire period of the Battle of the Atlantic deserves specific recognition that it seldom receives in American-centered accounts. Norway had approximately 1,000 merchant ships operating for the Allies when the German occupation began in April and May of 1940. Of these, approximately 70% eventually joined the Norwegian government in exile's merchant fleet, operating under British and Allied direction from ports in Britain and Canada. Norwegian tankers carried a disproportionate share of the petroleum products crossing the Atlantic, and Norwegian vessels were disproportionately represented in the sinking lists of the Drumbeat campaign. By the end of the war, Norway had lost approximately half its total merchant tonnage to enemy action, and roughly 30,000 Norwegian merchant sailors served aboard Allied vessels during the war, of whom more than 3,000 were killed. Per capita, Norway suffered some of the highest merchant marine losses of any Allied nation. The post-war treatment of merchant mariners by the governments they had served is one of those institutional failures that becomes more painful the closer you examine it. American merchant mariners were denied veteran status until 1988, more than 40 years after the war's end, when a court ruling finally compelled the recognition that Congress had repeatedly failed to grant through legislation. British merchant mariners received some benefits more quickly, but the full recognition of their wartime service remained contested for decades. Norwegian merchant sailors received somewhat better treatment from their government in exile, but the psychological wounds of the war, the survivors' guilt, the trauma of repeated sinkings for men who continued to sail convoy after convoy, were not addressed by any institutional framework. There were no programs for the men who had sailed in the Drumbeat campaign and survived. They went home and resumed their civilian lives, carrying an experience that most of their neighbors could not comprehend, and that their governments had spent years actively minimizing. The historiography of the merchant marine in the Drumbeat campaign has improved significantly since the 1980s. Partly through the work of researchers like Gannon and Blair, and partly through the dedicated efforts of memorial organizations and oral history projects that collected survivor testimony before the last witnesses died. The veterans of foreign wars and various maritime heritage organizations spent decades lobbying for the recognition that was eventually, belatedly, granted. The National Maritime Memorial was eventually designated in Washington. The names were eventually carved. But the delay between the service and the recognition is itself a historical fact, not a footnote. It tells us something specific about how democracies manage the memory of their most uncomfortable wartime failures. The merchant marine of the Second World War did not fit the heroic narrative of soldiers and sailors doing their duty. They were civilians, doing a job, dying at a rate that the government was embarrassed to publicly acknowledge, in a campaign that their own navy had failed to adequately protect them from. Recognition was not convenient, so recognition waited. The last thing that needs to be said about the merchant mariners of the Drumbeat campaign is this. The overwhelming majority of them continued to sail. Men who had been torpedoed once signed on to new ships. Men who had watched their shipmates die in burning oil returned to sea within weeks, because the cargo still needed to cross, and because for many of them, the sea was the only profession they knew. There was no word for this at the time, and there is no particularly adequate word for it now. It was not heroism in the dramatic sense. It was quieter than that, more persistent, more grinding. It was men doing the necessary thing in the face of a risk they understood precisely, in service of an outcome that history would vindicate and that their own governments would be slow to acknowledge. That quality of persistent, unrecognized, essential endurance is perhaps the defining human characteristic of the entire Atlantic campaign. Chapter 14. The commanders, Donitz, King, Andrews, and the architecture of decisions history has a tendency to personalize its most complex institutional stories, and the history of Operation Drumbeat is no exception. The campaign produced several figures whose decisions shaped its course in ways that have been argued over ever since, and whose personal characteristics, ambition, stubbornness, professional pride, analytical intelligence, bureaucratic rigidity, are threaded through the record in ways that cannot be fully separated from the structural factors that constrain them. Understanding the key commanders of the Drumbeat campaign requires holding two things simultaneously: the recognition that individuals matter, and the recognition that individuals are also products and prisoners of the systems they inhabit. Karl Dönitz, who commanded the German submarine force as Befehlshaber der U-Boot, commander of submarines, from the war's beginning, and became commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy in January of 1943, following the surface fleet's poor performance in the Battle of the Barents Sea, is the most analytically interesting figure of the campaign precisely because he was both right and catastrophically wrong at the same time. He was right about the tonnage war. He was right that submarines attacking merchant shipping could inflict war-decisive damage on the Allied economy. He was right that the American coast was vulnerable in the winter of 1941 to 42, and his campaign there exploited that vulnerability with genuine professional skill. The planning of Drumbeat, the phased deployment of boats to maintain continuous pressure, the extension of operational range through the U-tanker system. These reflected real strategic and operational intelligence, where Dönitz was wrong, and where his wrongness eventually became irreversible, was in his belief that the tonnage war could be sustained against an industrially mobilizing United States. He continued to believe, through 1942 and into 1943, that building enough submarines fast enough could outpace Allied countermeasures. He was correct that German shipyards were productive, that new submarine designs were in development, and that the theoretical monthly output of new boats was impressive. He was wrong about the pace of Allied learning. He was wrong about radar. He was wrong about the effectiveness of the Allied intelligence effort. He was wrong about the capacity of American industrial production to generate escort vessels, aircraft, and trained crews faster than his submarines could sink merchant ships. Each of these individual errors was understandable. Together, they constituted a strategic miscalculation of the first order. The post-war career of Dönitz is one of the more complicated epilogues in the history of the Second World War. He was appointed by Hitler as his successor in the final days of the war, served briefly as head of the German state in the days between Hitler's death and Germany's surrender, and was subsequently tried at Nuremberg on charges that included crimes against peace and war crimes related to submarine warfare. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. a verdict that was controversial at the time and has remained so among historians, partly because American Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted a written statement to the tribunal noting that the United States Navy had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific from the first day of its entry into the war. Dönitz served his full 10-year sentence and was released in 1956. He lived until 1980, writing his memoirs and giving interviews, and maintained until his death that the submarine campaign had been conducted within the laws of war, as he understood them. This was not a position historians uniformly accepted. Admiral Ernest J. King presents a different kind of biographical complexity. King was, by nearly all accounts, one of the most capable naval officers of the 20th century in terms of strategic comprehension, logistical management, and sheer force of will. He had transformed a Pacific fleet, reeling from Pearl Harbor, into a functioning offensive force within months. He had managed, with extraordinary skill, the allocation of American naval resources across 2 oceans and multiple theaters simultaneously. He was also, by nearly all accounts, extremely difficult to work with, blunt to the point of abrasion, suspicious of British advice, resistant to acknowledging American institutional failures, and in the view of his British counterparts, often more concerned with American naval autonomy than with Allied operational effectiveness. The specific question of King's responsibility for the convoy delay on the eastern seaboard in early 1942 will likely never be fully resolved to every historian's satisfaction, because the internal decision-making record is incomplete, and because King himself addressed the matter only obliquely in his post-war writing. What the record shows clearly is that the British offered assistance, trained escort groups, vessels, expertise, and that the offers were declined or accepted only slowly. What the record shows is that the coastal blackout was delayed for months after the threat was identified. What the record shows is that the convoy system, once eventually implemented in its full form, reduced eastern seaboard sinkings to essentially zero within 2 months of its proper establishment. The counterfactual, how many ships and how many sailors might have been saved if the convoy had been established in January rather than May, is not a calculation that can be made with precision, but the order of magnitude is not obscure. Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews, who commanded the Eastern Sea frontier throughout the critical period, is in some ways the most sympathetic of the major American figures in the Drumbeat story. He understood the threat. He understood his own inadequacy of resources. He wrote repeatedly to King's headquarters, requesting escort vessels, aircraft, and authorization to implement convoys. And the responses he received were consistently less than he asked for. He was managing a military emergency with the resources of peacetime, in an institution that had not built itself for this kind of war, on a coastline that had never expected to be a theatre of active naval operations. His decision to delay full coastal convoys until adequate escorts were available was consistent with official doctrine and reflected real resource constraints. Whether those constraints were as absolute as they appeared, given the British offers of assistance and the available civilian vessels that could have been pressed into service, is the question that the historical record leaves uncomfortably open. The British figures who attempted to advise and assist the Americans through this period deserve more attention than they typically receive. Roger Wynne, the submarine tracking room analyst, who sent the January 1942 warning about the Drumbeat boats, continued to provide processed intelligence to American naval authorities throughout the campaign's peak. His counterpart at the United States Navy's own submarine tracking operation, Commander Knowles, was building the American capacity for the same kind of analytical work. The relationship between these men, careful, professionally respectful, occasionally strained by institutional differences, was one of the more productive bilateral intelligence relationships of the entire war. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, who commanded Western Approaches Command before Houghton took over in November of 1942, worked with American escort commanders through the establishment of Argentia, Newfoundland, as a joint Allied base for Western Atlantic convoy operations. These are not household names. They deserve to be better known. Captain Frederick John Walker of the Royal Navy is the tactical figure whose individual contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic most clearly exceeded the strategic weight that his rank would suggest. Walker commanded the sloop HMS Stork in the critical convoy battles of late 1941, and from 1942 onwards commanded successive anti-submarine escort groups with a tactical aggressiveness and methodological precision that made him arguably the most effective U-boat hunter of the entire war. His development of the creeping attack, a method of attacking a deeply submerged submarine by having one escort hold sonar contact, while a second was guided onto it from ahead at slow speed, maintaining silence while the first directed the attack, was one of the most important tactical innovations of the campaign's later phases. Walker's groups sank more German submarines than any other comparable unit in the Allied order of battle. He died of a stroke in July of 1944 at the age of 48, having, by his own doctor's assessment, worked himself to death. The contrast between the fates of these commanders after the war ended tells its own story about how the Battle of the Atlantic was remembered and institutionally processed. King retired in December of 1945 and published his official report, which contained relatively little self-criticism of the Eastern Seaboard period. Dönitz went to prison. Andrews retired quietly. Walker was already dead. The institutional lessons of the Drumbeat campaign, the specific, hard-edged lessons about convoy doctrine, about accepting Allied expertise, about not letting pride override evidence, were processed primarily in the classified sphere, in revised naval doctrine and training programs, rather than in public accounts that might have generated the kind of critical examination these decisions deserved. The American public, which had not been told about the campaign at the time, was not invited to examine it in any systematic way afterwards. The reckoning was internal, doctrinal, and largely invisible. Chapter 15: Legacy, Memory, and What the Atlantic Still Holds. The floor of the Atlantic Ocean, between the American eastern seaboard and the coasts of Britain and Europe, contains, by the best estimates available, the remains of more than 3,000 merchant ships lost during the Second World War. Their wreckage lies at various depths, from the shallow waters off Cape Hatteras, where many drumbeat victims sank in less than 60 meters, to the abyssal plain of the mid-Atlantic, where some hulls lie at depths beyond the reach of any practical salvage or investigation. The oil from some of these ships is still slowly leaking into the water. In the shallow coastal zones, sport divers visit the more accessible wrecks and bring back objects: crockery, tools, personal effects, engine components. The history has not entirely vanished. It is still down there, in the dark, rusting. The physical memory of the Atlantic campaign is distributed unevenly. Britain, which lost shipping throughout 6 years of war, and whose coastal communities were directly affected by the Battle of the Atlantic, has a substantial commemorative culture around the campaign. The Atlantic Memorial in Liverpool, the convoy's primary European port, honours the men of the Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy's escort forces. Various Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy museums hold materials related to the campaign. Academic and naval historical literature in Britain has maintained a sustained engagement with the Battle of the Atlantic since the war ended, partly because it was a campaign in which British and Canadian forces bore the primary burden for the first 2 years, and whose outcome was essential to Britain's survival. American institutional memory of Operation Drumbeat. is, by contrast, notably incomplete. There is no dedicated national memorial to the American merchant mariners who died in the campaign. The granting of veteran status in 1988 was accompanied by no significant public commemoration of the scale of the losses. The sinkings on the American coast in 1942 are not part of the standard American public school curriculum for the Second World War. The campaign is essentially absent from the popular understanding of the war that most Americans carry. The museums and archives that hold the relevant materials are specialist institutions visited by researchers rather than by the general public. Pearl Harbor, Normandy, Iwo Jima. These are the reference points of American wartime memory. The burning tankers off Virginia Beach are not. This asymmetry of memory is not accidental. It reflects the pattern established during the campaign itself. The active management of public information that kept the scale of coastal sinkings from the American public in 1942, and that was never systematically reversed. The declassification of relevant naval records happened gradually and without fanfare. Michael Gannon's 1990 book, which was the first comprehensive public account of the campaign and remains the foundational text, was a work of academic history rather than popular publishing. It received respectful reviews and sold to the audience that reads serious military history. It did not, and could not, generate the kind of broad public reckoning that the scale of the disaster arguably warranted. The story never broke through into the mainstream of American historical consciousness. The Canadian dimension of this memory asymmetry is perhaps the most acute. The Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force bore a disproportionate share of the burden of North Atlantic convoy protection throughout the entire campaign period, operating with equipment that was generally older and less advanced than that available to the Royal Navy, in sea conditions that were among the most physically brutal on Earth. Canadian corvettes, small, wet, uncomfortable, aggressively sea-keeping vessels that were magnificent in their tactical commitment and brutal to live on, escorted the vast majority of the convoys, sailing from Halifax and Sydney, Nova Scotia, throughout the war. Canadian sailors died in these operations in numbers that represented, relative to the Canadian population, a significant wartime sacrifice. Canadian historiography of the Battle of the Atlantic, written by scholars like Mark Milner, whose detailed studies of the Royal Canadian Navy's anti-submarine campaign remain essential reading, is considerably more frank about the campaign's difficulties and the cost of the learning process than the equivalent American literature. The German memory of the U-boat campaign is its own complicated story. The submarine service entered German popular memory after the war through two parallel channels, the factual and the mythological, and the tension between them has never been entirely resolved. The factual channel is represented in the meticulous official history of the German submarine war compiled by post-naval historians, in the academic literature on the enigma and intelligence aspects of the campaign, and in the sober assessment of the campaign's failure that became the standard position of German naval historiography. The mythological channel is represented primarily in Wolfgang Petersen's 1981 film Das Boot, an adaptation of Lothar Gunther Buchheim's novel that was itself drawn from his experience as a war correspondent embedded on a Type 7 boat in 1941. The film is one of the most technically and psychologically accurate war films ever made, and it explicitly frames the submarine war as a story of ordinary men in an impossible situation, ultimately destroyed by the strategic failures of the leadership that sent them there. It is, among other things, a film about the cost of the tonnage war to the men who fought it on the losing side, the statistical reckoning of the entire Atlantic campaign, of which Operation Drumbeat was the opening American chapter, is necessary to place the individual episodes of this story in their full context. Over the course of the war, German submarines sank approximately 2,800 Allied merchant ships of all types, totaling approximately 14.5 million tons. More than 30,000 Allied merchant sailors were killed in these sinkings. Approximately 30,000 more were rescued from the sea after sinkings. The Royal Navy and its Allied partners lost approximately 175 warships, including 51 destroyers, to submarine action. Against these losses, Germany lost approximately 783 U-boats to all causes over the course of the war, with approximately 30,000 German submarine crew members killed, a casualty rate that represented roughly 75% of all men who served in the submarine arm. The Battle of the Atlantic destroyed both sides, over 6 years of sustained industrial and human attrition, on a scale that the specific opening episode of Drumbeat alone can only hint at. The technological legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic is perhaps its most durable contribution to the subsequent history of warfare. The anti-submarine doctrines developed through the painful learning process of 1941 through 1943 became the foundation of NATO maritime doctrine during the Cold War, when the Soviet submarine fleet presented a threat whose echoes were explicitly drawn from the German campaign. The convoy system, the hunter-killer group, the very long-range maritime patrol aircraft, the coordinated use of airborne radar and sonar. These were all products of the Atlantic campaign's learning process, and they were all carried forward into the Cold War strategic framework. The United States Navy's anti-submarine warfare capability in the Cold War period was built directly on the institutional and doctrinal foundations laid during the Battle of the Atlantic, including the hard lessons of Drumbeat. The historiographical evolution of the campaign is itself worth noting, because the story of how this history has been written reflects the story of how intelligence secrets are kept and eventually released. The essential role of Ultra, the intelligence derived from breaking Enigma, in the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was publicly unknown until the mid-1970s, when the British government formally acknowledged the Bletchley Park operation and authorized the release of relevant materials. Everything written about the Atlantic campaign before that revelation had been, of necessity, incomplete. The German success in reading Allied convoy ciphers through B-Dienst was similarly not fully established in the public record until the post-war German naval archives became accessible to researchers. Michael Gannon's 1990 book benefited from access to sources and analyses that were not available to anyone writing about the campaign in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s. The history of the Battle of the Atlantic is still, in a meaningful sense, being written, not because new events are occurring, but because archival access continues to improve, and because the questions historians ask of the available evidence continue to evolve. The broader historical significance of Operation Drumbeat, when placed in the context of the full Second World War narrative, is that it represents one of the clearest examples in the conflict of institutional unpreparedness meeting a prepared and capable adversary, and of the specific human cost that gap imposes, the gap between what the American Navy should have done and what it did do in the winter of 1942. Was not a gap born of cowardice or malice. It was a gap born of doctrine, of pride, of institutional inertia, of the difficulty of changing a large organization under sudden emergency pressure. These are not exotic or unfamiliar problems. They are the standard problems of any large institution confronting a threat for which it was not adequately prepared. What makes the Drumbeat case historically important is the precision with which its costs can be measured. In ships, in tons, in names carved on memorials decades too late, and the clarity with which the record shows that better choices were available, that warning was given, and that the warning was not acted upon with sufficient speed. The 5 submarines that left Lorient in December of 1941, those original 5, with their tourist guides to New York Harbor and their sealed orders and their 44-man crews, returned home safely to a hero's welcome. Not one was lost. They had killed dozens of ships, thousands of men, millions of tons of Allied material. They had done this in sight of American shorelines, against a coastline that had not decided it was at war, and the survivors of those ships, the men who made it into the lifeboats, who rode to beaches in New Jersey and North Carolina, who drifted in Caribbean swells for days, lived long enough to see their service unacknowledged for 4 decades. Some lived long enough to see it acknowledged finally, however imperfectly, and to receive something resembling the recognition they had earned. The ocean keeps what it takes and gives nothing back. The history, at least, can be spoken plainly. This was what happened. These were the people it happened to. They deserved better. The record should say so.